Dr. Oliver paced nervously in the bustling emergency room. His shift was nearing its end, but he knew he couldn't leave just yet. The sudden rush of patients brought in from an accident on the highway kept him on his toes, the chaos a constant companion. Then the doors burst open, and a stretcher was wheeled in. A man, unkempt and covered in dirt, lay unconscious, his body battered by what appeared to be a car crash. The EMTs called him John Doe, no identification, no family in sight. The man's vitals were crashing, and time was running out. The ER was already stretched thin, and Dr. Oliver's mind raced. There were strict hospital protocols. Money, insurance, these things mattered more than anything else in this institution. If the patient wasn't insured or didn't have the right background, the hospital would hesitate to provide treatment. But Oliver didn't hesitate. Get him prepped for surgery. Now, Dr. Oliver ordered, ignoring the muttered protests from the nurses and the knowing looks from his colleagues. The rules were clear. But Oliver's heart was clear, too. He couldn't let this man die because of some arbitrary rule. He scrubbed in quickly, steeling himself for the delicate surgery ahead. The OR was filled with the steady hum of machines and the frantic voices of his colleagues. He worked with precision, his hands steady despite the pressure. "Come on, you're not giving up today," he muttered to himself as he operated. Hours passed, but Oliver refused to give up. He could feel the exhaustion creeping in, but his resolve only grew stronger with each stitch he placed. This man had no one. He was a stranger, a forgotten soul. But that didn't matter to Oliver. This man's life mattered. As the surgery ended and the man was moved to recovery, Dr. Oliver's heart was filled with a quiet satisfaction. The procedure had been a success. The man, whoever he was, would live. But just as he exhaled a breath of relief, the door opened. The hospital administrator, Mr. George, entered, flanked by a few others from the administration. Oliver knew what was coming. He had broken the rules. He had acted without consulting the bureaucracy. "You went against our policies, Dr. Oliver," Mr. George said, his tone cold and stern. "That decision has consequences." Dr. Oliver's heart sank, but his eyes didn't waver. "I saved a life. A human life. And in doing so," Mr. George shot back, "you've put the entire hospital's funding at risk. You're fired." A numbness settled over Oliver as he looked around at his colleagues. They didn't speak up. They had all seen it. The rules. The red tape. And the sacrifices that had to be made. But Oliver couldn't go back. He had done the right thing. Now he would face whatever came next, knowing he had chosen humanity over bureaucracy. Little did he know, this decision would change not just his life, but the future of the hospital. And perhaps, even the future of healthcare itself. The days following Dr. Oliver's firing passed in a blur. The moment he had been escorted from the hospital, a weight settled upon his chest. The hospital, the very institution he had once believed in, had turned its back on him. He knew he had made the right decision, he had saved a life, but the consequences of that choice were becoming increasingly clear. His mother, a stern yet loving woman, called him the morning after the incident. "Oliver, are you okay?" Her voice trembled slightly. She had always been the one to hold things together for him. "I'm fine, Mom. I'll figure it out." Oliver hadn't realized how much the sting of being fired would hurt, how much it would feel like a betrayal. But what hurt more than anything was knowing the system he had sworn to serve was willing to let him go just to protect its cold, profit-driven policies. The fire within him, the need to keep fighting, was igniting. Yet, he was lost, unsure of his next step. As the days passed, the media caught wind of the incident. News outlets picked up the story, Dr. Oliver, the young doctor who saved the homeless man despite hospital protocols. His face flashed across screens, with both praise and scorn in equal measure. Some called him a hero, while others criticized him for undermining hospital procedure. The homeless man, whose life Oliver had saved, remained unconscious for a few days. There was little information about him, and the hospital staff couldn't provide much. But then, something unexpected happened. The man woke up. Dr. Oliver had left the hospital with a heavy heart, unsure of what would happen next, but he hadn't forgotten about his patient. He had done everything he could to ensure the man would survive. It wasn't just about the surgery, it was about giving him a chance to live, to have a second shot at life. Yet, when the man opened his eyes, the story took an astonishing twist. As the man slowly came to, the sounds of machines beeping and nurses bustling around him filled his senses. He looked up, squinting against the harsh hospital lights. I'm alive," he asked, his voice weak but filled with wonder. "You're alive," one of the nurses confirmed, giving him a warm smile. "Thanks to Dr. Oliver." The homeless man, disoriented but grateful, was allowed some time to recover. But it wasn't long before something about his presence caught the attention of the hospital staff. His demeanor, though worn and ragged, carried an air of quiet authority. His eyes, though tired, were sharp, calculating even. And when the hospital administrator, Mr. George, visited the ward to check on the condition of the homeless man, he immediately sensed something unusual. The man, still in a patient gown, stared out of the window as if waiting for something, or someone. "Who is he?" Mr. George asked the nurse, his voice filled with suspicion. "That's John Doe," the nurse responded. "He was brought in from an accident a few days ago. No ID, no family. But he's recovering well." Mr. George's face twitched, a momentary look of disbelief flashing across his face. "I'll be right back," he said abruptly, walking away. Soon after, the nurse came to Dr. Oliver's small apartment, carrying an urgent message. "You need to come back to the hospital," she said, almost out of breath. "The patient, the one you saved, he's not just some homeless man." Dr. Oliver's mind raced. Could it be that the man was someone important? Someone with a secret life? His curiosity piqued, Oliver returned to the hospital, unsure of what to expect. When he arrived, Mr. George was waiting for him in his office, alongside a stern-looking man in his 50s. The man's features were sharp, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the ragged clothes the patient had worn just days before. "Dr. Oliver," Mr. George began, "this is Dr. Kenneth, a renowned surgeon and a longtime partner of this hospital." Oliver's eyes widened. Dr. Kenneth? He had heard of him, of course. The man was legendary in the medical field, known for his groundbreaking work in neurosurgery. But what was he doing here? "It's true," Dr. Kenneth spoke, his voice gruff but laced with a hint of admiration. "I'm the one who asked for Dr. Oliver's help. The man you saved was my father. A man I thought I had lost to his own demons." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. The homeless man, the one he had just seen as another patient, was Dr. Kenneth's father. The realization hit him with force. This wasn't just a random act of kindness, it had connected him to one of the most influential surgeons in the country. "Your father?" Oliver began, still struggling to process the information. "Yes," Dr. Kenneth replied. "My father had been living on the streets for years after a fallout between us. It was complicated. But he's been the biggest inspiration in my life, even if I didn't realize it until now." Dr. Kenneth's father had once been a respected neurosurgeon, but years of personal tragedy and addiction had led him down a path of self-destruction. He had vanished from Dr. Kenneth's life, only to reappear in the most unexpected of ways, lying in a hospital bed, saved by a young doctor who had no idea of the man's true identity. "You've given me back the most important person in my life, Dr. Oliver," Dr. Kenneth continued. "I owe you everything." Oliver, still trying to digest the news, nodded slowly. "It wasn't about who he was. I couldn't let him die. I did what any doctor would do." "But you did more than that," Dr. Kenneth insisted. "You gave my father hope. And for that, you will always have my gratitude." The next few days unfolded in ways Oliver never could have predicted. Dr. Kenneth worked tirelessly to ensure his father received the care he needed, while Dr. Oliver, though fired, was still the subject of much media attention. His reputation as a doctor who saved lives despite the odds grew, and his story began to spark debates across the country. People were talking about the ethical dilemmas in healthcare, the cold, bureaucratic systems that often put profit over people. However, the media wasn't the only force taking an interest in Oliver's actions. Back at the hospital, Mr. George, who had initially condemned Oliver's actions, found himself under pressure. The board was receiving complaints, and public opinion was turning against them. Some spoke about changing policies to prioritize patients over financial gain. Soon, a movement began to take shape. Oliver's name became synonymous with compassion, and his story led to widespread discussion about the healthcare system's flaws. It was clear now that his actions were more than just a personal victory, they were the spark for a larger conversation about change. But not all was well for Dr. Oliver. Though he had saved the life of a prominent figure's father, he found himself alone, without a job, and uncertain of his future. Still, his resolve didn't falter. If anything, he had just begun. Little did he know, this was only the beginning. Dr. Oliver had never anticipated the storm of events that followed the day he saved a homeless man, now revealed as Dr. Kenneth's father. His actions, once considered a breach of protocol, had ignited a firestorm. The media continued to sensationalize his story, but the public's opinion was divided. Some viewed him as a hero, while others saw him as a rule-breaker who jeopardized hospital operations for one life. At first, Oliver remained silent, trying to process everything in the solitude of his small apartment. But as the weeks passed, he found himself growing restless. The calls from the media persisted, but so did the whispers in the healthcare industry. Hospitals across the city were watching closely, some questioning their own ethical guidelines. The system, Oliver realized, was starting to fracture under the weight of his decision. Then came the letter. It arrived unexpectedly, just days after the hospital's internal investigation into the incident. Oliver opened the envelope, half expecting it to be another rejection or reprimand. But the contents were far more startling. It was an official invitation to meet with the hospital board. They wanted him to come in for a discussion. The letter did not specify the purpose, but Oliver's instincts told him this wasn't just a chance to discuss his reinstatement. No, this was bigger. The way the hospital had treated him had begun to weigh heavily on the board, and they had no choice but to confront the growing controversy. Oliver arrived at the hospital, his heart pounding in his chest. The sleek, sterile hallways, once filled with hope and ambition, now felt foreign to him. The place that had been his home, his calling, was now a battleground. He had fought for the lives of countless patients, but now he was fighting for something much more personal, the integrity of the healthcare system and his place within it. He was escorted to a large conference room where the hospital board sat, their faces grim and unreadable. At the center of the table, a familiar figure stood, Dr. Kenneth. Dr. Oliver, Mr. George began, his tone colder than Oliver remembered, "We've had quite a few discussions regarding your actions. We're here to talk about the consequences, and the future." Oliver sat down, meeting their gaze with steady resolve. He didn't feel like the same doctor who had walked in just a month ago. The whirlwind of events had changed him, had made him see just how deeply flawed the system was. But he was no longer afraid to speak out. "I know I broke protocol," Oliver began, his voice unwavering. "But when it comes to saving lives, I don't regret my decision. I didn't know who that man was when I performed the surgery. I didn't care. I just did what any decent human being would do, I saved a life." Dr. Kenneth nodded solemnly, his expression reflecting both gratitude and an understanding of the conflict Oliver was facing. The room remained silent for a long moment. "I've had the chance to think long and hard about this," Mr. George finally spoke. "You've made a name for yourself in the public eye, and many people are praising your actions. But some are questioning whether you were right to put the hospital's policies at risk. We need to restore faith in the system, in our procedures." Oliver clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had expected this. The cold logic of bureaucracy, the need to preserve the status quo at all costs. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now. "I understand that the system is important," Oliver said, his voice firm. "But it's broken. And if we keep following rules that don't put patients first, then we're no better than the very system we claim to improve." The board shifted uncomfortably. Oliver's words hung in the air, and for the first time since the incident, he felt like he was being heard. But it wasn't enough. The board members exchanged looks, and Oliver saw the decision in their eyes before they even spoke. "Dr. Oliver," Mr. George said, his tone stiff, "we've come to a conclusion. While we acknowledge your actions in saving Dr. Kenneth's father, we cannot condone your blatant disregard for hospital policy. As such, your dismissal stands." The room fell silent. Oliver felt the crushing weight of the decision. It wasn't what he had hoped for, but it was what he had expected. But just as he was about to stand up and leave, Dr. Kenneth interjected, his voice calm but forceful. "Wait," he said, his gaze never leaving Mr. George. "I've spoken with the board about this, and I'm willing to make an offer." Oliver turned to face him, his confusion clear. Dr. Kenneth's eyes were resolute. "If Dr. Oliver had not taken the risks he did, my father would have died. I owe him my father's life. And in return, I want to do something to ensure his actions weren't in vain." Mr. George raised an eyebrow. "What are you suggesting?" "I propose a new department in this hospital," Dr. Kenneth continued, his voice gaining strength. "One focused not just on following protocol, but on compassion, on patient-centered care. And I want Dr. Oliver to lead it." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. Could this be happening? "There's a growing movement," Dr. Kenneth added, turning to the board. "The people, the patients, they want change. They're tired of the bureaucracy that keeps them from receiving the care they deserve. If we don't adapt, if we don't evolve, we'll be left behind." The board members exchanged looks, murmuring among themselves. Mr. George seemed skeptical, but Dr. Kenneth's proposal had clearly struck a chord with the rest of them. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. George spoke again. "This is a significant shift in hospital policy. But given the circumstances, we're willing to reconsider." The tension in the room was palpable. Dr. Oliver held his breath, waiting for the final word. "We'll approve the new department," Mr. George said, his voice almost grudging. "But it comes with conditions. Dr. Oliver, you'll be reinstated. But this will be the last chance. Any more breaches, and you'll be gone for good." Oliver nodded, a sense of cautious relief washing over him. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He had fought for what he believed in, and he had won. As the meeting came to a close, Dr. Kenneth pulled Oliver aside. "You're not just a doctor, Oliver," he said, his voice low. "You're a force for change. We'll need you to lead the charge. You can't do it alone, but together, we can make healthcare something that actually serves people." Oliver nodded, determination flooding his veins. The road ahead would be difficult, but he was no longer afraid. The battle for justice had just begun. Oliver walked out of the conference room, his mind still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The hospital hall seemed less sterile now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the conversations and decisions that had transpired. He had won, yes, but the victory was bittersweet. The fight had only just begun. He could feel the eyes of the staff, the murmurs behind his back, the skepticism that hung in the air. But he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not after everything he had sacrificed. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The world felt different. The burden of uncertainty still loomed, but there was a spark of hope in his chest, one that refused to be extinguished. He had saved a life. He had fought for what was right. And now, he had a chance to make a difference. But there was still the question of what came next. The new department was his responsibility now. A place for compassion, a place where patients came first. It wasn't going to be easy. There were old systems to break, deep-seated biases to overcome. The administration wasn't going to embrace this change willingly. But he had the support of Dr. Kenneth, and most importantly, the support of the people who needed the change the most, the patients. That night, as Oliver sat at his kitchen table, his mother's voice echoed in his mind. She had always told him that doing the right thing wasn't easy, that the world would push back against him when he tried to make a difference. But she had also told him that the rewards of sticking to his convictions were worth the struggle. She had believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He opened it to find Grace standing on the other side, her eyes filled with concern and something else, something he hadn't seen before, but that felt undeniably real. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "I wanted to see how you're holding up." Oliver smiled, though it felt a little hollow. "It's been a long day," he replied, stepping aside to let her in. "It's not over, though. I've got a lot of work ahead of me." "I know," she said, walking in and closing the door behind her. "But you're not alone in this, Oliver. I'm with you. We're in this together." He looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, and felt something stir within him, a warmth, a connection that he hadn't expected. There had always been an unspoken bond between them, ever since their first meeting, but now it felt stronger, more defined. Grace stepped closer to him, her presence comforting, grounding. "I believe in what you're doing," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I believe in you. And I'll help however I can." Oliver's heart swelled at her words, but a part of him hesitated. He had always kept his personal life separate from his work, afraid that the two would blur and complicate everything. But standing there with Grace, he realized that maybe it was time to stop running from what he truly wanted. "I don't know how this is going to work," Oliver admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've always put my career first, and now I'm trying to change everything. It's scary." "I know it is," Grace said, reaching out to take his hand. "But you're not doing it alone. And that's what makes all the difference." For the first time in what felt like forever, Oliver felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and setbacks, but with Grace by his side, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. Over the next few weeks, things began to shift. Oliver's new department started to take shape. He brought in people who shared his vision, individuals who were passionate about patient care and who were willing to challenge the status quo. Together, they began to build something truly special, a department where patients were treated with dignity, where doctors and nurses were encouraged to listen to the people they served, and where compassion was not just a catchphrase but a guiding principle. But the fight wasn't without its obstacles. Mr. George, though begrudgingly supportive, continued to keep a watchful eye on the department. The old ways of the hospital were deeply entrenched, and change was never easy. There were those who resisted, who saw this new approach as a threat to the power they had spent years cultivating. And as Oliver soon discovered, even the most well-intentioned reforms could be sabotaged by those with the most to lose. One evening, as Oliver was reviewing patient charts in his office, a message came through on his phone. It was from Dr. Kenneth. "Meet me in my office. Urgent." Oliver's heart skipped a beat. What now? He grabbed his jacket and headed out, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived at Dr. Kenneth's office, he was greeted with a grim expression. "There's been a breach," Dr. Kenneth said, his voice low. "Someone from the board has been leaking information about the department. They're trying to shut us down." Oliver's stomach sank. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but he hadn't expected sabotage so soon. "Who's behind this?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. "We don't know yet," Dr. Kenneth replied, shaking his head. "But we can't let this slide. If they succeed in shutting us down, everything we've worked for will be lost." Oliver clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. "We're not giving up. Not now. We'll fight. We'll expose them." And so, they did. Oliver and Dr. Kenneth worked tirelessly, gathering evidence, reaching out to allies within the hospital who were willing to risk their careers to stand up for what was right. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when they thought they might lose everything. But through sheer determination and a shared belief in the change they were fighting for, they managed to uncover the truth. The culprit was none other than Mr. George himself, the very man who had once tried to shut Oliver down. It was a betrayal that shook Oliver to his core, but it only fueled his determination to press on. In the end, the truth came to light. Mr. George was removed from his position, and the hospital underwent a major restructuring. Oliver's department was not only saved but expanded, with the hospital becoming a beacon for patient-centered care, a model for hospitals across the country. As the months passed, Oliver's vision for a compassionate healthcare system began to take root. New policies were introduced, prioritizing patients' needs over profits. Doctors and nurses were trained to treat not just symptoms, but people. And the impact was undeniable. Patient satisfaction soared, and for the first time in a long time, people began to trust the system again. Oliver stood in front of his department one day, looking out over the team he had built. Grace stood beside him, her hand in his. Together, they had fought for a better world, and together, they had won. "This is just the beginning," Oliver said, his voice filled with hope. "We've made a difference. And we'll keep making it. One patient at a time." And with that, Oliver knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was ready. Ready to fight, ready to love, and ready to make the world a better place, for everyone.